Welcome to the Sawyer Free Library. Thank you all for coming. We're very glad you could come tonight. I'm Beth Pocock. I'm the Assistant Director at the library here. We're so pleased you could come to the preview lecture for Homer at the Beach, an exhibition that will be at Cape Ann Museum from August 3rd to December 1st. Highly anticipated. I want to thank Courtney Richardson for helping me. Oliver Barker is here, which we appreciate, the new director of Cape Ann Museum, so you might want to say hi to him. And let me introduce Bill Cross, who's going to preview Homer at the Beach.
Thanks, Beth. Thanks, Beth. And thanks to all of you for coming tonight. My wife is in the back and tells me that I rarely speak too softly. But if I do, please holler or wave your hands. Okay. I once worked for a man who told me that I was too tall and we needed to do something about that. Does that sound better? More? As Beth mentioned, I'm curator of an exhibition which will open on August 3rd at the Cape Ann Museum here in Gloucester, which is where Winslow Homer executed this painting. It's one of the many wonderful works he made during his earliest years as a marine painter, aged 33 to 44, 1869 to 1880, on which the show will focus. Over the next 40 minutes, I will cover a lot of material at a fast clip and then take your questions. My hope is to give you an overview of the exhibition and some reflection on what our research for it has already taught us about this much-loved American painter. And before I do any of that, I should introduce to you, hopefully with another wave of his hand, the museum's new director, Oliver Barker, in the back with the suit and tie. Oliver is thrilled about this moment in the cultural life of Cape Ann as he leads this wonderful institution, which means so much to so many here in this community. Thank you for coming tonight, Oliver. As you know, the museum is nationally recognized for its superb collection of oil paintings by Fitzhenry Lane, the Gloucester-born maritime painter and key figure in American Luminism. But important as Lane is, the even bigger story of art on Cape Ann is that of a series of American artists who found their way to Gloucester and its surrounding communities in the years after Lane's death in 1865. From Marsden Hartley to John Sloan to Edward Hopper, who met his wife in Gloucester, yet nevertheless preferred the Cape named after a fish to the one named after a queen, to Stuart Davis. But of all these great artists who followed in Lane's footsteps, none has more scholarly significance or popular appeal than Winslow Homer. The idea of a Homer exhibition at the Cape Ann Museum began with this painting from 1869, 150 years ago, originally titled Manchester Coast. We agreed in 2016, after a number of years of discussion, to mount a very small Homer exhibition focused on his underappreciated Manchester works of the late 1860s, commemorating their 150th anniversary. As we spoke with lenders and scholars, however, we heard advice that we should enlarge the show beyond Manchester and beyond that short period of the late 1860s and take full advantage of Gloucester's big part in the Homer story. And so we followed that advice and widened our scope to address the whole of Homer's marine works from the late 1860s through the summer of 1880, in which he made this remarkable watercolor, which we will be borrowing from a private collection in Virginia. We found that the show's premise was more powerful than we had ever imagined, allowing us to create an exhibition far larger than originally we had planned, and even larger than we had anticipated as we were preparing our budget last summer. That, by the way, is the gentlest of fundraising appeals. And I am sure that Oliver, like me, would be happy to answer questions later on that topic. On the 150th anniversary of Homer's first marine works, our project will tell this story: how over a period of 11 years, in spite of crushing criticism, and you'll get a taste of it shortly, a talented young man had the courage to give up his principal source of income, then illustration, in the midst of a deep, bitter 6-year recession, to take up a new medium, watercolor, at which he quickly excelled, and which in fact contributed to his making some of his greatest wood engravings, and to focus his considerable talents and energies on a single subject to which he would dedicate much of the remaining 30 years of his life: the sea. This was a period in which he not only grew into a mature artist, but during which he created works of extraordinary beauty, given Homer's outstanding talents as a painter in watercolor, a medium in which he created not only true masterpieces of American art, but among the greatest such works ever made anywhere in the world. Surprisingly, despite the attention, enormous attention, which Homer has received over the years, this exhibition here in Gloucester will be the first close examination of Homer's earliest marine works. Today, 52 private and public collections, from the Annisquam Historical Society to the Yale University Art Gallery, have agreed to join the Cape Ann Museum as lending partners to this project, which will appear solely at the Cape Ann Museum, opening August 3rd and closing December 1st. The exhibition will be in 8 parts, following Homer's journey from the late 1860s through the summer of 1880. Our story begins not on Cape Ann, but in the crowded resort of Long Branch, New Jersey, which inspired several Homer wood engravings and 4 important oil paintings. In the course of our research, we visited the Arkell Museum in Canajoharie, New York, which has a full-time staff of 1, but an excellent collection of Homer's work, including this painting, which the museum ultimately, after more than a year of discussion, agreed to lend to us. It's one part of Homer's most ambitious Long Branch picture, Low Tide, which he exhibited just once, 150 years ago, at an exhibition in New York. The reviews were withering, with one describing the painting as a watering place deformity. Homer removed Low Tide before the end of the exhibition and took his knife to it and dismembered his own painting. This is one of 2 parts of the picture which survive. Once the Arkell approved its loan, we immediately set down the path with the owner of the other part, which is now located in Madrid. The Homer at the Beach exhibition will reunite, for only the 2nd occasion in U.S. history, the 2 parts of this historic work. we've been able to glean the specifics of Homer's time in Long Branch with remarkable precision in the summers of both 1868 and 1869. In those same 2 summers, as I mentioned, he also came to Manchester, where he made this privately owned portrait of his longtime friend John Murray Brown, who was a leader in the Boston publishing world and ran the firm Little Brown. And he went to Singing Beach, where he made this preparatory sketch for the painting I showed you earlier. And his location for that sketch was just where, 5 years earlier, Fitzhenry Lane had made one of his last drawings. And through the miracles of 21st century science, we have dramatically faded the Fitzhenry Lane drawing, but here it is. It looks a lot better if you come and see it in the galleries on or after August 3rd. So consider this an invitation to come early and often to the show. The catalog for the show will include an essay by the distinguished scholar John Wilmerding investigating the connections between the stories of Lane and of Homer. And of course, I have another essay in the catalog. The show's 3rd section will focus on Homer's first trip to Gloucester, where he developed an intriguing wood engraving and, among other works, this sparkling dune scene, which appears to be based on visits he made to Coffin's Beach in West Gloucester. And with this big screen, it is a bit faded. It is a sparkling scene in the flesh. And you all know where Coffin's Beach is. Homer returned to Gloucester in 1873 for a turning point in his career. The previous summer, his parents had moved from Massachusetts to Brooklyn, and his mother was a very gifted amateur watercolorist. Her being in his orbit in New York, starting in 1872, meant that she was more engaged with the New York art world, where her watercolors would shine. And he was also more aware of this new medium, which was practiced extensively by women, but was viewed as not necessarily as good as oil paintings. He, in 1873, perhaps inspired partly by Mom, took up watercolor, a medium that initially he tried with such hesitation that when he exhibited his first 10 watercolors, he gave none of them titles or prices. This is one of those first 10, and this is the only other one which can be identified with any certainty. It was the basis for one of his greatest wood engravings. And each of these registers his comprehension of the tragic circumstances that confronted many, many Gloucester families that summer of 1873, in which more men died serving the commercial fishing industry in one storm in late August than had died through more than 4 years of civil war. That same summer of 1873, Homer made a delightful watercolor, which was the basis for his famous painting of 3 years later, Breezing Up. In the summer of 1874, he returned to the coast, but interestingly not to Cape Ann. Homer went with a friend to the east end of Long Island, where he made this picture, now at the National Gallery, which is inspired by the French artist Boudin. We believe Homer made another, almost identically sized painting on panel that summer, which for the first time we will allow visitors to see side by side with the National Gallery's picture. It's not universally accepted as Homer's work, although we think he made it at the same place and time. And looking forward, we'll be giving you, as visitors, the opportunity to determine your own opinions of the authenticity of the tent. The summer of 1875 was another very important one in the life of Homer and his family, since it was his first trip to Maine, prompted by his younger brother's honeymooning in Prout's Neck, where 8 years later Winslow would resettle from New York. Homer spent a month in York, close to the southern edge of the state, and made this major painting, which I will discuss further in a moment, and several wonderful drawings. Homer spent several summers of the late 1870s in upstate New York, but returned to the coast in 1880, traveling first to Greenwich, Connecticut, where he made a group of about a dozen watercolors in late June and early July 1880, focused primarily on the theme of the fashionable, sophisticated young woman. Homer posed several very similar models in and near a waterfront forest in Greenwich, Connecticut, casting them in meditative moments, each alone in her thoughts, at one with the beauty of her setting. He arrived in Gloucester later that same summer of 1880 for the single most productive season of his life, during which he made about 100 watercolors. They include this one, which is a lot more colorful than it looks on this screen, and has not been seen in public since the year Homer painted it. It was in the same family for 124 years until the painter Jamie Wyeth acquired it, and he is now lending it to this exhibition. In this remarkable sunset scene, in which the beauty of the sky is matched by the ugliness of the fish gaping at us like a gargoyle, a great example of Homer's sly sense of humor. We will include in the show this subtle study of emerging moonlight over Gloucester Harbor and this depiction of a ship stranding, which occurred on 10 Pound Island, a stone's throw from where Homer was sleeping at the time. And this anticipates later work, to which we will allude in the show's epilogue. One example being this unusually frieze-like watercolor inspired by a wreck Homer witnessed in England during his second and last European trip, begun a few months after his last extended Gloucester summer. So I've given you a brief overview of the chronological journey Homer made and geographic journey he made as a marine artist from 1869 to 1880. But I haven't really addressed what new light we've been able to shed on such a widely studied painter. Today, most people think of Winslow Homer as the maker of monumental seascapes, such as this one. But the central question which we are addressing long precedes Homer's late great masterpieces. We're seeking to understand how this young man blossomed into the mature painter so beloved today, best known for his marine works. How did he move from pictures such as this to pictures such as this? We think that that question can be answered best by viewing his earliest marine works in context. Homer, born in Boston, raised in Cambridge and Belmont, and from age 23 living in New York, exhibited his first marine picture in April 1869, when he had just turned 33. Despite several ambitious paintings over the previous few years, he was making his living then not as a painter, but as a draftsman who developed designs for other artisans. to convert into wood engravings. Both the wood engraver and the draftsman worked on a fee basis for the publisher, either of a book or a periodical such as Harper's Weekly. The publishers owned the rights and all components of the process. And while the prints made after Homer's designs were strikingly superior to those based on the drawings of other artists, that really didn't do Homer much good. Making these drawings for Appleton's Journal, Harper's Weekly, and other publishers put food on his table. But by the late 1860s, it had done as much as it could to advance both his economic position and his artistic talent. Homer had to do something to keep moving ahead. He did two things. First, like many other American artists, particularly young American artists, he went to France. His 10 months there were revelatory and ended only when he ran out of money. Second, he went to the sea. One of the ironies of Homer's career is that before the late 1860s, when he first came to Cape Ann, this artist, now so closely associated with marine painting, had never made one. This plein air picture, among his first marine works, reflects both what he learned from French Barbizon artists and his ambition to do something truly new and create a distinctive form of modern American painting. The critics at the time just didn't understand what Homer was doing. Today, if we find fault in these works, it's due to their restraint. For example, in the disciplined, limited palette Homer applies here. But then things were different. French painting was new and unfamiliar enough that these works scandalized the critics. Homer had to read in the newspaper that his painting represents nothing on or under the earth but a dirty doormat. We intend that this project show clearly how, over these years, the painter withstood such hostile criticism and used it to spur him on to develop into a mature style through a close examination of these works in context, using a wide variety of related material, including historic photographs, such as this one on loan from the Annisquam Historical Society. We also will draw on the Cape Ann Museum's own collection of related artifacts, such as ship models, and bring into comparison with the original Homer works other contextualizing materials which may surprise you. One example is women's clothing, such as this water cure costume from the 1870s, which is one of the earliest bathing suits still extant anywhere in the United States, and which Homer's model seems to have forgotten on her last visit to a historical society in upstate New York. The exercise of placing these works of art in context has shed new light on Homer in a variety of ways, of which I'd like to offer three with examples. First, Homer had an uncanny ability to recognize the spirit of a place and select visual metaphors to capture that spirit. He had a knack for deftly developing compositions within which he could depict those metaphors with a compelling sense of their elusive truth. So what do I mean by that? Here's an example. On his first trip to Maine, the ever-observant Homer noticed a new kind of double-ended vessel. This is not a dory. To this day, this type of vessel, often called a peapod, is distinctive to the Maine coast. It's double-ended. The bow and the stern are identical. And he posed in his picture an archetypal Maine fisherman with this archetypal main vessel. There's the vessel. His model was a local man, George Henry Donnell, then 24 years old, whom we've been able to identify through the hard work and cross-disciplinary insights of the staff of the Old York Historical Society. This project is an enormously collaborative endeavor. Our ability to place Homer's works in context depends heavily on partners such as Old York, the Boston Athenaeum, the Ennisquam Historical Society, and many, many other organizations. In creating a picture of Donnell, his setting, and his distinctive vessel, Homer executed a work as evocative as any of the paintings of French peasants which Millet made emblems of honest toil in the fields of France. Homer's development of this powerful painting depended in part on his really getting to know the place, slightly upriver from York Harbor at Fisherman's Walk, which you see here. This is exactly where Homer painted that painting, where he began his work on that painting, where he positioned himself for that. And Homer was so observant, he captured not only the stones ground by the churning river, but also the worn bricks. You see here that local housewrights had a habit of discarding just there at that river's edge. Over his first month in Maine, Homer made abundant use of his model, whom he also placed in another picture, almost identical in dimensions to Winding Line, which he might have meant as its pendant. This work is signed but far less finished in its execution. We see the same model and the same peapod at the same location as Winding Line, but from a vantage point allowing a view turned slightly to the west. The perspective allows the painter to include the mast of a tall sailboat, right here, moored at the wharf in front of a historic drawbridge known as Sewell's Bridge, which was a source of local pride that year leading up to the centennial. Other examples of Homer's mastery of metaphors in his journey over the 11 years on which we focus include his frequent use of boys on the shoreline of Gloucester, especially in 1873, the period of his first watercolors. Many of these wonderful first watercolors led, as I said, to superb illustrations. And his metaphor of boys at play also ties to themes in literature at the time, including books by his near exact contemporary, Mark Twain. A second way in which this project is shedding light on Homer and his work is by placing him more clearly in a social context. We've not unearthed letters between the painter and Mark Twain, but we have learned a lot more about Homer's connections with other artists. Even from his youth, Homer presented himself as a dapper fellow, but from the beginning, there was something guarded about Homer's manner. He had an intensely private personality, which seemed to harden in later life, causing one writer to say that to visit him in his studio is literally bearding a lion in his den. For Mr. Homer's strength as an artist is only equaled by his roughness when he does not happen to be just in the humor of being approached. Our research has hinted at a different side of Homer. Despite his privacy, he had close friends, a lot of them. This is Homer in Paris in 1867 with Albert Kelsey, who signed the back of the photograph Damon and Pythias, figures from Greek legend who from ancient days have been admired as exemplars of true friendship. And in the spirit of friendship, a brief mention of two other exhibitions. First, As you may know, Steve Rosenthal is a nationally renowned photographer and resident of Cape Ann. Steve will be doing his own exhibition at the Cape Ann Museum parallel with the Homer at the Beach exhibition. This shot taken at dawn on Singing Beach in Manchester is one of the wonderful photographs that Steve will include. His exhibition will reflect his many years of visiting Cape Ann, beginning in Rockport in the late 1940s when he was a boy, and ultimately settling here with his wife, Kit. Steve has honed his powerful artistic gifts as he has walked in the footprints of those such as Homer who have come before him. And second, we're timing the Homer at the Beach exhibition, opening August 3rd, to coincide with another Homer exhibition, which will open at the end of August at the Harvard Art Museums. That show will be called Eyewitness and will focus principally on Harvard's own superb collection of Homer's work. But back to how the Cape Ann Museum exhibition will address Homer's social context. We will introduce viewers to a man who was not only Homer's friend, but his leading Gloucester patron, George Marsh. Marsh built this peculiar stick-style house just a year before Homer remodeled a stable in Prout's Neck to make his studio, using an architect who had been practicing in Boston the previous year. The breadth of Homer's artistic creations alludes to the importance of his social context. They include a group of his rare ceramic works, most of which he developed as part of a New York social group called the Tile Club. The club had few rules. Membership was limited to 12. Meetings were held weekly on Wednesdays, and each member was given a nickname. Homer's was the Obtuse Bard. Perhaps the club's most important principle was that the members should enjoy one another's company with humor, generally aided by the liberal consumption of food and drink. The members worked at a common table to create a variety of 8-inch square decorative ceramic tiles like this one, but art making seems, for most of them, to have been secondary to camaraderie. Another window into Homer's social context comes through fuller recognition of his friendship with John Lafarge, who completed this ambitious painting in 1868. The very next year, Homer made this painting I showed you earlier, which was titled originally Manchester Coast, and this was the very first marine painting that he exhibited. Lafarge understood the hostile climate for innovative art well enough to not exhibit his painting. Homer did exhibit his, and the critics hated it, one saying that the most noticeable point appears to be the dashing of the ocean spray above the rocks, but as indicated by Mr. Homer, it resembles the work of a boy who has dashed a spitball upon a newly papered wall. What the critics couldn't have understood was how much Homer had already learned from Lafarge, and how much he had learned also from Japanese prints, of which Lafarge was an early collector. Both pictures synthesize the lessons of Japanese prints, including a high horizon line, a contrast between the distant view and the exacting description of the foreground, and a slightly asymmetrical, vertigo-inducing composition. But perhaps the most surprising insight into Homer's social context came out of hotel registers from the crowded resort of Long Branch, New Jersey, where Homer developed this painting at the MFA. More than 20,000 guests registered at the hotels of Long Branch over the summers of 1868 and 1869. Among them, we found the names of just 2 artists. One, of course, was Homer, arriving in August 1868. The other artist also arrived in August 1868, exactly 1 day before Homer. Surprisingly, he was a significantly older artist, Martin Johnson Head. He'd stayed at the United States Hotel, less than 2 minutes walk from Homer's hotel, which was the Metropolitan and was operated by the same hotelier. He seems to have begun this unusual painting while he was at Long Branch. The topography on the left of the picture matches Long Branch perfectly, as does the date. We know of no previous evidence linking Heed to Homer or to Long Branch. However, as a newly admitted member of New York's Union League Club, Heed was certainly aware of the art market he served, including its patrons, critics, and fellow artists. It's difficult to believe that the arrival of his younger colleague, so closely timed to his own, was a coincidence. 3,000 miles of Atlantic Ocean now separate these two parts of Homer's ambitious low-tide picture, one in Madrid and the other in upstate New York. It seems somehow right that on the same occasion on which this pair is reunited, we can also think about this pair, who together may have strolled the beach at Long Branch. That these two great figures in American art, so different in age, subject, and temperament, were nevertheless connected, if only in this one instance, reminds us that Homer lived in community rather than in complete isolation. So we've discussed Homer as the master of metaphor and of his setting in a social context. The third way in which our research has shed light on his work reflects a fresh understanding of how Homer understood truth-telling. When I have selected the thing carefully, I paint it exactly as it appears, he is quoted to have said. That is, Homer used his remarkable powers of observation in a very specific way, considering nearly as deeply his framing out what he did not want to paint as his framing in what he did want to paint. A simple example is this picture, which he composed in such a way that he would exclude the derelict warehouse visible on the right in this photograph. And once Homer set his frame, he painted with exactitude not the cartographic reality, but the truthful appearance to him. The $10 word for Homer's approach is verisimilitude. We see Homer's idiosyncratic truth-telling in this ambitious watercolor based on sketches he made at 10-Pound Island, where he lived with the lighthouse keeper and his family during the summer of 1880. He deliberately framed out the vast expanse of harbor at his feet so that he could zero in on the action close to the Gloucester skyline, including the towers of City Hall, the Baptist church steeple next to it, and smoke rising from the chimney of a house near Duncan's Point. Another example of Homer's verisimilitude is this picture of bathers on Singing Beach. In analyzing his process, we see that first he executed an oil sketch of Eaglehead on the spot in the French manner of plein air painting. It's interesting to note that just a few years earlier, and I'm afraid I have another 21st century miracle coming, Fitzhenry Lane made another drawing from the same spot, but with a characteristically punctilious commitment to a mapmaker's sense of truth. Here we go. Trust me, Lane recorded a boxy house on the left and felt an obligation to do so, whether he regarded it as jarring or not. Even in his oil sketch, Homer framed out that house, which would have been just over there. Martin Johnson Heed, by contrast, the year before Lane's drawing, displayed a commitment to poetry above all, leading him not only to frame out that house, but to frame in an island that isn't quite there and isn't that large, and to produce a sunset in the southern sky. whose rosy tones strike us as more lurid than true. He takes artistic license pretty far. And of course, Heat is an especially interesting counterpoint to Homer because of the connection between the two men, which I just cited. Homer's third way, different from both Lane and Heed, was evident in his final painting of Eagle Head, based faithfully on his oil sketch, but also with the insertion of these figures, these three figures, likely in his studio in New York, which helps explain the slightly awkward shadows. And interestingly, the tallest of the three figures stands just tall enough to block the sight of a second house built right after Homer made his oil sketch and right in the middle of his view. We're borrowing this handmade stereograph from the Manchester Historical Museum. The more work we've done on Homer, the more we realize that despite his significance to our nation as a whole and to the world, he was deeply rooted in context, a context which can be understood only with patient, disciplined attention, grounded in place and in knowledge, both of the history of art and of cultural, economic, and social history. This mission, Art in Context, is what the Homer at the Beach project is all about. And so it's just right that the Cape Ann Museum, located in the heart of the remarkable city where Homer created most of his early marine works, should host this exhibition. Of the 51 Homers we plan to display, 49 will be borrowed from other collections, both private and public. But what the museum lacks in its depth of ownership of Homer works, it makes up for by its rich sense of context. Geographic context, yes, but also many other elements of context which afford a fresh perspective achieved through the careful formation of a mosaic of insights. We invite you to join us from August 3rd forward to see Homer at the Beach. And in the meantime, on behalf of the museum, Oliver, myself, our donors, our lenders, and other partners, and on behalf of this gentleman, we thank you for coming and welcome your questions. Thank you. Thank you. Should we have some lights? Yeah, good. And are there questions? Yes, all the way in the back. Thank you. I'm going to need to repeat your questions, and you may need to speak up so I can hear them to repeat them.
My question just is how do you feel that the work that you're exhibiting over the summers, do you think it's going to have a large influence on the painters that we have here in Cape Ann and helping them be able to, express their work and grow? And just what are your thoughts on how it's going to affect the art community?
I hope I've heard the question correctly, but please tell me if I need to hear it better. I believe that the question is, how can this exhibition make a difference to artists who are working on Cape Ann and in this region today? Thank you. We think that there can be no better inspiration for artists working today, whether they're painters or sculptors or any other kind of artist, than Winslow Homer. He is an artist in formation over these 11 years. He's finding his identity. And so the story of his evolution from an illustrator bound to publishers for his living to an artist is the story of formation, it's of calling, and it's a story that has never been told. this is a story that I hope you will engage with deeply if you're an artist or if you're not, and one to tell artists about. It's also the story of a man who experiments, and some of the experiments are more successful than others. And that's inspiring too, to know that even Winslow Homer was human. So not only seeing his earliest watercolors, but seeing his experiments in the decorative arts, seeing him try different places to find different metaphors and experiment with different meanings, different techniques. I hope that you find it as powerfully evocative as I have over the period of preparing for this exhibition. Thank you. Yes?
Why Gloucester? How did he get here? What brought him here? I know water, but I mean, why here? How did he get here? Do you know the origins of his connection here?
So we can speculate about how he first came to Cape Ann, and we can speculate intelligently. He, as I mentioned, had, just as Lane did, roots in printmaking, principally in wood engravings. But before he began making wood engravings, he worked in a lithography shop in Boston. And he worked for a man whose brother-in-law was an early Manchester summer resident, and there were very few of them. So it's not unreasonable to think that that brother-in-law, who was also an entrepreneur in the theater and in distributing prints, was his route to Cape Ann. And he was in Manchester for 2 summers, not too far from Gloucester. I think he probably had enough of the tourist scene in Long Branch and was seeking a quieter location. But even today, there's a little more variety in Gloucester than there is in Manchester. And it wasn't too hard to get from Manchester to Gloucester. So I think it was proximity to Gloucester and a recognition of the variety of things that he might paint here. That first summer of 1871, when he came to Gloucester, he painted not only tourists on Coffin's Beach, but also a shipyard, which was at Vincent's Cove. And thanks to the remarkable insights of Eric Ronberg, maritime historian at the Cape Ann Museum, we know a lot about that shipyard where the schooner that Howard Blackburn would be on was also built. And we have photographs from 1876 of that schooner being constructed at the very same place that the schooner was where Homer painted it in 1871. So we think that it was partly the variety of things he could paint here that drew him to Gloucester. I think I saw another hand in the back. Oh, there, yes, thank you.
Were you able to ascertain what influence, if any, that Henry Lane might have had on the works of Homer?
Thank you. I think the question, if I have heard it correctly, is have we been able to determine how Lane influenced Homer? That's right. John Wilmerding has written a brilliant essay which speculates about exactly that subject. There's no documentary evidence that we can look to, but the parallels between their careers and between their lives are striking. And it seems quite reasonable to think that Homer, as a young man working in Boston for several years before going to New York would have had exposure to Lane's art at the Boston Athenaeum and other places, and in a smaller world than we have today, may have even had an opportunity through mutual friends and business acquaintances to meet Lane himself. We don't know that, but it's not an unreasonable guess that their paths crossed. The fact that he came to Manchester and went to exactly the places where Lane made two of his very last works, I mean, within a few feet, standing in the same place, is striking. And so you just wonder, but we can't prove it. Does that help? Yes, thanks, Ken.
Could you elaborate a little bit more, please, about how other museums and collectors have assisted you in the development of this exhibition, and particularly how they view the exhibition?
Thank you. The question for those in the back is, how have other collections, both other institutional collections and private lenders, collaborated with us, and how they viewed this exhibition and the associated catalog? That's been one of the exciting parts of this story. This is a very ambitious project for the Cape Ann Museum to take on. It's 53 collections, it's 96 objects. We have collections from all across the country who are participating in this project. And they're not only participating as lenders, but as collaborators doing important archival research as a part of it. So what I spotlit for Old York, I could also do for Greenwich, Connecticut, and for Monmouth County, New Jersey. It is incredible how much help we've received from historical societies and museums around the country. And of course, we also have received help from the donors who have made this possible on a much larger scale than we ever could have hoped for. And we're grateful for all of those donations, many of which came from within this immediate community. We did receive a major institutional grant for the first time from the Mr. and Mrs. Raymond Horowitz Foundation. And that was also very helpful, but most of the funds came from individual donors. What they have viewed as uniquely valuable about this exhibition is that it is a project of art in context. And they view the Cape Ann Museum as uniquely able to put on an exhibition of this kind because it is ultimately about showing art in context, geographic context, of course, but also other elements of context. Understanding the relationships between art and this industry, which had an enormously evocative schooner as its emblem, but also had a colossally high human cost. You know, Gloucester sailed through, if I may say so, the 6-year deep recession of the 1870s, but that was at the cost of many, many men dying. And that dependence on a single industry was something that Homer comprehended as having a number of dimensions, including this dimension of tremendous mortality. So I think that what scholars around the country have, and institutional lenders and our private lenders have perceived, is that the Cape Ann Museum can do with this show, despite its more modest financial foundations than the Met or the National Gallery, what the Met and the National Gallery cannot do, because we can place these great works of art in context in a way that is only possible because of the kind of museum the Cape Ann Museum is. And I hope that this exhibition proves to be an inspiration for further great work as the museum looks forward to its 150th anniversary in 2023 and Gloucester's 400th anniversary of the English settlement here. And prove that this exhibition proves to people near and far that the Cape Ann Museum has much to offer to this community and to its region and to the nation. Thank you.
I don't need to add anything. Like you, my heart is very full of fascinating information and beautiful images. I know Bill has put a lot of work into this, and we're very grateful, Bill. Can't think of a better way to spend a rainy evening on our beautiful Cape Ann. So.